Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Cars on the Road. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Uncle Jay. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, The Brew Crew. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, In the Night Garden. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Peppa Pig. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, The Apang 18. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Tish Tash. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Angry Kid. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Something Special. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Giggle Biz. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Show Me Show Me. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, UEFA Champions League. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Brendan Barney. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Willie Omega. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Thomas and Friends. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, The Green Balloon Club. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Space Chickens in Space. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Teletubbies. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Balamurie. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Morgs. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Teletubbies. After that later, Cars on the Road. Coming up on Ethan and Friends. Next, Thomas and Friends. After that later, Something Special.